Everyone on the plane thought the quiet man in seat 3B didn't belong in first class, until one passenger humiliated him publicly, and discovered too late that the stranger beside him was someone the entire world already knew. But what happened next changed everyone on that flight forever. The private lounge inside the airport hotel was built for people who never waited. Soft piano music drifted through hidden speakers. Crystal glasses reflected warm amber light across polished wooden tables. Business executives spoke in low voices behind expensive suits while hotel staff moved carefully through the room with practiced precision, never too fast, never too loud. Everything inside the lounge felt controlled. Predictable. Exclusive. And then the old man walked in. The automatic doors slid open quietly, but somehow the entire atmosphere shifted the moment he stepped inside. Not dramatically. Not loudly. Just enough for heads to lift for half a second before pretending not to notice him again. He wore a faded gray coat with rainwater still clinging to the shoulders. His shoes looked worn from years of walking. A small leather bag hung from one hand, old enough that the corners had begun to crack. Nothing about him matched the room. Nothing about him looked expensive. The hostess near the entrance froze for the briefest moment before recovering her professional smile. "Good evening, sir," she said politely. "May I help you?" The old man nodded gently. His voice was calm, almost soft. "I'm meeting someone here." The hostess glanced around the lounge instinctively, as if searching for the person who could possibly be expecting him. "What name should I tell them?" The man adjusted his grip on the bag. "Daniel Mercer." The hostess repeated the name silently in her mind. It didn't ring any bells. No reservation under Mercer had been marked important tonight. No VIP profile. No executive alert. She smiled again, but this time it looked more procedural than welcoming. "Do you know who you're meeting, sir?" The old man looked toward the back windows where rain streaked softly against the glass. "They know me," he replied. That answer didn't help. Across the lounge, a man sitting near the fireplace lowered his whiskey glass slightly while watching the exchange unfold. Ethan Holloway, CEO of Holloway Dynamics. 47 years old. Sharp jawline. Tailored navy suit. Silver watch worth more than most people's monthly salaries. Everything about him projected authority without effort. And at that moment, the old man standing near the entrance annoyed him immediately. Not because he had done anything wrong. Because he looked out of place. Ethan leaned slightly toward the hotel director seated beside him. "Is this public access tonight?" he asked quietly. The director followed Ethan's gaze toward the entrance. His expression changed instantly. "No," he said under his breath. The hostess was still trying to manage the situation politely. "I'm sorry, sir," she said carefully, "this lounge is reserved for private guests this evening." The old man nodded once. "Yes," he replied calmly. "I know." The answer caught her off guard. For a second, she didn't know how to continue. Ethan watched the exchange with growing irritation. He had spent the entire evening negotiating a billion-dollar acquisition. Investors from Singapore had flown in. Executives from Berlin were arriving within the hour. And now an old man who looked like he'd walked in from a bus station was standing in the middle of the lounge creating uncertainty. The director stood up smoothly. "I'll handle it," he murmured. He crossed the room with controlled professionalism. "Good evening, sir," he said, stopping beside the hostess. "I'm afraid there may be some confusion." The old man looked at him patiently. "I don't believe there is." The director maintained his smile. "This is a restricted executive event." "I'm aware." "Then perhaps you entered the wrong floor." "No," the old man replied softly. "I entered the correct room." A faint tension began spreading through the nearby tables. People weren't openly staring yet. But they were listening. Ethan leaned back in his chair, watching with narrowed eyes. The director lowered his voice slightly. "Sir, if you're waiting for someone, perhaps we can assist you downstairs." The old man remained calm. "I was invited here." "By whom?" The man paused briefly. "Mr. Holloway." That pulled the room tighter instantly. Several executives exchanged glances. Ethan frowned from across the lounge. The director blinked once. "I'm sorry." The old man finally looked directly at him. "Ethan Holloway invited me." Silence. Not complete silence, but the kind where people stop hearing the music. The director forced a small laugh. "I think there's been a misunderstanding." "There hasn't." Ethan finally stood from his seat. Slowly. Confidently. The room subtly shifted around him the moment he moved. Conversations quieted. Staff straightened slightly. Attention followed him automatically. He approached the entrance with controlled irritation. "I don't know this man," Ethan said before anyone else could speak. The old man looked at him calmly. "Yes," he replied. "You do." Ethan stopped a few feet away now. Up close, the contrast between them felt even sharper. One looked built by wealth. The other looked weathered by life. Ethan crossed his arms. "No," he said firmly. "I would remember." The old man studied him for a moment. Not angrily. Not defensively. Just carefully. "You were younger then," he said quietly. That answer unsettled Ethan more than it should have. Something about the man's voice felt strangely familiar. But Ethan pushed the feeling away immediately. "This event is private," he said sharply. "I'm going to ask you to leave." The old man nodded slowly, almost thoughtfully. "I traveled a very long way to be here tonight." "That's unfortunate." The room tightened again at Ethan's tone. The hostess lowered her gaze slightly. Even the director seemed uncomfortable now. But Ethan didn't notice. Or didn't care. The old man glanced toward the rain outside again. "I wasn't sure you'd recognize me," he admitted softly. Ethan exhaled impatiently. "Because I don't know you." The old man finally reached into the inside pocket of his coat. Instantly, security near the hallway shifted position. Not aggressive, but alert. The old man noticed, and slowly removed a folded photograph. Old. Worn. Bent at the edges from years of being carried. He held it carefully between his fingers before offering it toward Ethan. "Maybe this will help." Ethan hesitated before taking it. At first, he looked annoyed more than curious. Then his expression changed. Very slightly. The photograph showed two people standing beside a broken pickup truck on a dirt road somewhere deep in the countryside. One was a teenage boy. Thin. Dirty-faced. 17, maybe 18 years old. The other was the old man standing in front of him now. Rain tapped softly against the windows. The room remained perfectly still. Ethan stared at the picture longer than expected. Something distant moved behind his eyes. "Memory," the old man spoke quietly. "You were trying to get to Chicago." Ethan didn't answer. "You had $30 in your pocket." Still nothing. "And your father had just thrown you out." The silence inside the lounge deepened completely now. Because whatever this was, it was no longer simple. Ethan slowly lifted his eyes from the photograph. The confidence in his posture had shifted almost invisibly. "You," he said quietly. The old man gave a small nod. "Yes." Ethan looked at him again. Really looked this time. Past the coat. Past the shoes. Past the years, and suddenly the memory hit him all at once. A highway. Cold rain. An empty road. And a stranger who had stopped when nobody else would. The room watched Ethan carefully now. Because something inside him had just changed. Not publicly. Not dramatically. But enough that everyone could feel it. The old man folded his hands calmly over the leather bag. "I didn't come here for money," he said softly. Ethan still couldn't speak. "I came because 30 years ago," the old man continued, "you promised me something." The room held its breath. And for the first time that night, Ethan Holloway looked uncertain. The lounge had gone so quiet that even the sound of rain against the windows felt louder now. Nobody moved. Nobody reached for a drink. The executive seated near the fireplace no longer looked relaxed. Conversations had disappeared completely, replaced by the strange tension that forms when powerful people realize they may not fully understand the situation unfolding in front of them. At the center of it all, Ethan Holloway still stared at the old photograph in his hand. The image trembled slightly between his fingers. Not enough for most people to notice. But enough. The old man remained calm beside the entrance, rainwater still darkening the shoulders of his worn coat. He did not look proud. He did not look angry. If anything, he looked tired, like someone carrying a memory longer than he ever expected to. Ethan finally lifted his eyes. "You're Walter," he said quietly. The old man nodded once. "Yes." The name landed softly inside the room, but it changed everything. Because suddenly Ethan no longer looked like the powerful CEO everyone recognized. He looked like someone much younger. Someone caught off guard by a part of his life he had buried years ago. The hotel director glanced between them carefully. "You know him?" he asked. Ethan didn't answer immediately. His eyes stayed fixed on Walter, and somewhere behind those eyes, old memories had already started resurfacing whether he wanted them to or not. 30 years earlier. November. Freezing rain. A dark highway outside Kansas City. Ethan had been 18 years old and furious at the world. He had left home with one backpack, $30, and enough pride to convince himself he didn't need anyone. By midnight, the rain had soaked through his jacket. By 2 in the morning, nobody had stopped for him. Cars passed endlessly through the darkness, headlights slicing across wet pavement while Ethan stood beside the road pretending he wasn't scared. But he had been scared. Cold. Hungry. Alone. Then an old pickup truck had finally slowed beside him. Walter. At the time, Ethan barely noticed what the man looked like. Only that he had stopped. Walter had rolled down the window halfway. "You trying to freeze out here, kid?" he had asked. Ethan remembered climbing into the truck without hesitation. The heater barely worked. The dashboard light flickered constantly. And the cab smelled faintly like coffee and engine oil. Walter hadn't asked many questions. He simply drove. Miles of rain-soaked highway stretching endlessly ahead while Ethan slowly realized he had nowhere real to go. At one point Walter handed him half a sandwich wrapped in paper towels. "You should eat," he'd said. Ethan remembered pretending not to be hungry before finally taking it anyway. The memory hit him so clearly now that it almost hurt. Back inside the lounge, Ethan slowly lowered the photograph. "How did you find me?" he asked quietly. Walter gave a faint shrug. "You're not hard to find anymore." A few nervous chuckles almost surfaced around the room but disappeared immediately when nobody else laughed. Ethan glanced briefly toward the watching executives. He suddenly became aware that everyone was listening. Watching. Judging. The balance of the room had shifted. Earlier, Walter had looked like someone who didn't belong. Now Ethan wasn't sure who looked more uncomfortable. Walter spoke again gently. "You told me if you ever made something of yourself, you'd help people the way I helped you." Ethan swallowed slightly. The memory came back instantly. The promise. Young. Emotional. Half frozen in the passenger seat at 3 in the morning. I won't forget this, Ethan had said back then. Walter had laughed softly while keeping his eyes on the road. You probably will. I won't. You're 18. You'll forget lots of things. Ethan remembered turning toward him stubbornly. No, he'd insisted. If I ever become successful, I'll help people too. I swear. At the time, Walter hadn't seemed impressed by the promise. Just amused. But Ethan had meant it. At least back then. Now, standing inside a luxury airport lounge worth more than Walter's entire life savings probably ever had been, Ethan suddenly felt the distance between who he became and who he once thought he would be. The silence stretched. Finally, the hotel director cleared his throat carefully. Mr. Holloway, he said quietly, perhaps we should move this conversation somewhere private. But Walter shook his head gently before Ethan could answer. No, he said. Private conversations are usually how people avoid uncomfortable truths. That line landed hard. Several executives shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Ethan exhaled slowly through his nose. What do you want from me? He asked. Walter looked almost disappointed by the question. That's the first thing you ask. Ethan immediately realized how it sounded. But pride kept him from correcting it quickly enough. Walter adjusted the leather bag in his hand. I told you already, he said calmly. I didn't come for money. Then why now? Walter glanced around the luxurious lounge. At first, I wanted to see if the boy from that highway was still somewhere inside the man standing here. The words sat heavily in the air. Ethan looked away briefly. And for the first time that evening, he couldn't ignore what everyone else in the room was silently noticing. Walter had walked in with dignity. Ethan had responded with judgment. The contrast was becoming impossible to escape. A woman seated near the fireplace finally spoke softly. What happened after that night? Every eye shifted toward her. Walter looked at Ethan before answering. He stayed with my family for almost 3 months, Walter said. Several people looked visibly surprised. Ethan closed his eyes briefly. He hadn't expected that part to be said aloud. Walter continued calmly. My wife cooked for him. My daughter gave him her room. I helped him find work at a machine shop until he saved enough money to leave. The room felt different now. Not tense. Reflective. Ethan rubbed his jaw slowly. You never asked for anything, he murmured. Walter smiled faintly. People don't always help because they want something back. That line cut deeper than anything else so far. Because Ethan suddenly realized something awful. He had spent so many years inside rooms built around transactions that unconditional kindness had started feeling suspicious to him. The realization sat heavily in his chest. One of the executives near the back leaned toward another person quietly. I had no idea Ethan came from nothing. Ethan heard it. And strangely, that embarrassed him less than the way he had treated Walter 5 minutes earlier. Walter slowly looked around the lounge again. You built an incredible life, he said honestly. Ethan didn't answer. But somewhere along the way, Walter continued gently, you started measuring people the same way others once measured you. Silence. Pure silence. Nobody in the room could escape the truth in that sentence. Not even Ethan. Especially Ethan. He looked down at the old photograph again, then at Walter's worn coat. Then at the expensive room surrounding them. And suddenly he remembered something else. The machine shop. Walter coming home exhausted every evening. Walter secretly slipping extra food onto Ethan's plate because he knew the boy was still hungry. Walter giving him bus money the day he left even though Ethan knew they couldn't afford it. The memory hit harder than before because now Ethan understood what it had cost. Back then, Walter had almost nothing. And still gave. Ethan finally looked up. You should have called me years ago, he said quietly. Walter's expression softened slightly. I tried. Ethan frowned. What? Walter reached slowly into his coat pocket again. This time nobody reacted nervously. He removed several folded envelopes. Old. Yellowed with age. Still unopened. Ethan stared at them in confusion. Walter held them out carefully. They were returned. Ethan took the envelopes slowly. Each one carried old company addresses Ethan had abandoned years earlier while building Holloway Dynamics. His throat tightened. You wrote to me? Walter nodded. My wife got sick. The room seemed to freeze again. Ethan looked up sharply. Walter's eyes drifted briefly toward the rain outside. She died 8 years ago. A deep silence swallowed the lounge whole. No whispers now. No movement. Only stillness. Ethan stared at the unopened letters in his hands like they weighed 100 pounds. When? He asked quietly. Walter gave a faint shrug. It doesn't matter anymore. But it did matter. Ethan could feel it. Every person in the room could feel it. Because suddenly this wasn't just a story about kindness. It was a story about forgetting. And the cost of forgetting someone who once saved you when nobody else would. Walter adjusted the strap of his worn leather bag again. I didn't come to make you feel guilty, he said softly. Then why come at all? Ethan asked. Walter looked directly at him now. And for the first time that night, his calm expression carried sadness. Because your promise mattered to me more than you think. Nobody in the lounge moved after Walter said those words. Because suddenly the room no longer felt expensive. It no longer felt important. The polished marble floors, the crystal glasses, the million-dollar conversations happening there only an hour earlier, all of it seemed strangely small compared to the old envelopes resting in Ethan Holloway's hands. The unopened letters looked fragile. But the silence around them felt heavy enough to crush the entire room. Ethan stared at the faded handwriting across the envelopes. Walter Mercer. Rural Route 12. Kansas. 3 letters. All returned unopened. All carrying different dates spread across nearly a decade. His throat tightened. The executives watching from nearby tables no longer looked entertained or curious. Most had stopped pretending not to listen altogether. Some sat frozen with discomfort. Others looked quietly reflective. Because everyone inside the lounge understood the same thing now, success had not protected Ethan from becoming the very kind of person he once hated. And for the first time in years, he seemed aware of it too. Walter stood patiently near the entrance, rain still tapping softly against the windows behind him. He didn't look angry about the letters. That somehow made it worse. If he had shouted. If he had demanded something. If he had arrived bitter or resentful. Ethan could have defended himself emotionally. But Walter wasn't doing any of that. He was simply telling the truth, and truth spoken calmly is often harder to escape than anger. Ethan finally looked up slowly. Why didn't you come sooner? He asked quietly. Walter gave a faint smile. You were busy building your life. That's not an answer. No, Walter replied softly. It's just the one I gave myself for a long time. The room tightened again. Ethan looked back down at the envelopes. One of them had water stains across the corner. Another looked partially torn from being processed through mail systems over and over again. And suddenly Ethan imagined Walter sitting somewhere at a small kitchen table writing those letters carefully by hand. Waiting for replies that never came. The image hit harder than he expected. What did the letters say? Ethan asked. Walter hesitated briefly. Then shrugged. Different things. Ethan's voice lowered. Like what? Walter looked toward the windows again before answering. The first one just said I was proud of you. That sentence landed quietly inside Ethan's chest. I saw your company on television, Walter continued. You were opening your second factory back then. Ethan remembered that interview. He had been 38 years old. Confident. Sharp. Standing in front of cameras talking about vision and innovation and perseverance. While somewhere in Kansas, Walter had been watching. Proud. And Ethan never even knew. The second letter? Ethan asked carefully. Walter exhaled slowly. My wife had started treatment by then. The room seemed colder somehow after those words. Ethan closed his eyes briefly. What kind of treatment? Cancer. Nobody spoke. Even the staff standing near the walls looked shaken now. Walter's expression remained calm, but softer than before. She kept telling me not to write you, he admitted. Said you probably had your own life by then. Ethan felt something sharp twist painfully inside him. What did you ask for? He said quietly. Walter looked surprised by the question. Nothing. Ethan frowned. You said she was sick. Walter nodded. She was. Then why write me? Walter smiled sadly. Because when people save your life, you wonder sometimes what became of them. That answer broke something inside the room. Several passengers looked away entirely now. One woman near the fireplace wiped quickly beneath her eye before pretending to adjust her glasses. The hotel director shifted uncomfortably beside the bar. Nobody had expected this night to become personal. Human. Real. Ethan slowly sat down in the nearest chair like his legs no longer trusted him fully. The old photograph remained in one hand. The unopened letters in the other. And across from him stood the man who once gave him shelter when he had nothing. Walter spoke again gently. The third letter was after she passed. Ethan lifted his eyes slowly. Walter's voice never shook. That somehow made every word feel heavier. I almost didn't send that one. Why? Walter looked down briefly at the leather bag in his hand. Because grief teaches you not to expect answers. Silence spread across the lounge again. Deep. Still. Unavoidable. Ethan swallowed hard. When did she die? November. Ethan's chest tightened instantly. November. The same month Walter had picked him up on that highway 30 years earlier. The memory collided painfully inside his mind. Cold rain. Truck headlights. A stranger stopping when nobody else would. And now that stranger had buried his wife alone while Ethan stood in tailored suits giving speeches about loyalty and leadership. The contrast made him feel sick. Walter noticed the shift in Ethan's expression. You don't need to carry all of it, he said quietly. Ethan looked up sharply. What? Walter gave a small shrug. Guilt. The word settled heavily into the room. Ethan leaned forward slightly. You wrote me because your wife was dying. Walter nodded once. And I never answered. Walter remained silent. Ethan looked at the envelopes again. You needed help. Walter shook his head gently. No. Then what did you need? This time Walter answered immediately. To know you remembered. The sentence hit harder than anything else that night. Not money. Not favors. Not influence. Just remembrance, human remembrance. Ethan lowered his head slowly. And for several long seconds, the CEO of one of the largest technology firms in the country simply sat there unable to speak. Nobody interrupted him. Not the executives. Not the staff. Not even Walter. Because some realizations need silence to fully arrive. Finally Ethan looked up again. I did forget, he admitted quietly. The honesty in his voice changed the atmosphere instantly. Not because it solved anything, but because it was the first completely unguarded thing he had said all evening. Walter studied him carefully. Yes, he replied softly. You did. No cruelty. No accusation. Just truth. And somehow truth without anger felt impossible to defend against. Ethan rubbed his hand slowly across his mouth. I told myself I was too busy, he murmured. Walter nodded faintly. That's what successful people usually tell themselves. The executives nearby shifted again. Some lowered their eyes. Because now the conversation no longer belonged only to Ethan. It belonged to everyone in that room who had sacrificed pieces of themselves chasing status. Walter slowly walked farther into the lounge for the first time. Nobody stopped him now. The hostess quietly moved a chair for him near Ethan. Walter thanked her softly before sitting down. The movement itself felt symbolic somehow. Earlier, he had been treated like someone who didn't belong in the room. Now the room itself seemed to adjust around him naturally. Ethan stared at the old man sitting across from him. You still helped me, he said quietly. Even after I disappeared. Walter frowned slightly. What do you mean? Ethan looked down at the photograph again. I built my entire life on lessons I learned from you. Walter's expression softened with surprise. You probably don't even realize it, Ethan continued. The way you treated people. The way you listened before speaking. The way you helped without making someone feel small. A faint smile touched Walter's face. And yet here we are. The sentence wasn't cruel. But it was honest enough to hurt. Ethan nodded slowly. Yeah, he admitted. Here we are. Rain continued sliding softly across the windows while the lounge sat wrapped in complete stillness. Outside, airplanes moved through the darkness beyond the glass. Inside, nobody cared about flights anymore. Because something far more important was unfolding. Walter leaned back slightly in the chair. You know what surprised me most tonight? He asked. Ethan looked at him carefully. What? Walter's eyes moved briefly around the luxurious room. How quickly everyone decided who mattered. The silence after that line felt enormous. Because everyone inside the lounge had done exactly that. Including Ethan. Especially Ethan. The old man folded his hands calmly. I walked in wearing old clothes, he continued softly. And before I said more than 10 words, people already knew where they thought I belonged. No one in the room could deny it. The hostess lowered her gaze again. The director remained motionless. Even Ethan couldn't look away from the truth anymore. Walter gave a small, tired smile. It's strange, he said. When you're poor, people think dignity is connected to appearance. Ethan stared at him quietly. But dignity, Walter continued, is how you treat people who can offer you nothing. The word settled into every corner of the lounge. Heavy. Permanent. Unforgettable. And for the first time in a very long time, Ethan Holloway felt ashamed of the man he had become. The private dining room inside the Grand Meridian Hotel carried the kind of silence money often creates. Crystal chandeliers reflected warm golden light across polished marble walls while soft piano music drifted through hidden speakers overhead. Every chair had been perfectly aligned before the guests arrived. Every glass stood untouched beside folded black napkins. It was the type of room designed to make power feel comfortable. At the center of it all sat Raymond Hale, founder of Hale Dynamics, billionaire investor, one of the most recognizable businessmen in New York. And tonight, he looked irritated. He adjusted the cuff of his expensive watch and glanced toward the entrance for the third time in less than 2 minutes. They're late, he muttered. Around the table, several executives exchanged careful looks but said nothing. Nobody liked correcting Raymond Hale when he was in this mood. Across from him sat his son, Tyler Hale. 24 years old. Perfect suit. Perfect haircut. Perfect confidence. At least on the outside. Tyler leaned back casually in his chair, scrolling through his phone while the older executives maintained uncomfortable silence around him. "They'll come," Tyler said without looking up. "People always come when you invite them." Raymond exhaled slowly through his nose. "This meeting matters," he replied. "If the Donovan contract goes through tonight, we expand internationally before the end of the year." Tyler smirked faintly. "And if it doesn't?" Raymond finally looked at him directly. "Then you'll learn how expensive failure can be." That answer ended the conversation instantly. The room returned to silence again. Outside the glass walls of the private dining suite, waiters moved carefully through the luxury restaurant carrying silver trays beneath soft lighting. Wealthy guests laughed quietly at distant tables while city lights stretched across Manhattan beyond the windows. Everything felt controlled. Until the restaurant manager suddenly appeared near the entrance. He looked nervous. Very nervous. Raymond immediately noticed it. "What is it?" he asked sharply. The manager hesitated. "Mr. Hale, there's a situation near the front lobby." Raymond's expression darkened. "What kind of situation?" The manager swallowed carefully. "There's a guest refusing to leave." Tyler laughed softly under his breath. "So-called security." The manager shifted uncomfortably. "Security already spoke with him." "And?" "He still won't leave." Raymond leaned back slowly, irritation building. "This is a five-star establishment," he said coldly. "Why is someone causing a scene in my dinner meeting?" The manager lowered his voice. "He says he's waiting for someone." Tyler rolled his eyes. Probably another guy pretending to be important. But the manager still looked uneasy. "There's something strange about him." Raymond frowned slightly. "What does that mean?" The manager hesitated again before answering. "He doesn't look homeless exactly, but his clothes are old, his shoes are worn out. And yet he's acting like he belongs here." Tyler smirked immediately. "There it is." Raymond looked impatient now. "Handle it." "We tried." "Then try harder." The manager nodded nervously and disappeared back toward the lobby. Tyler shook his head. People like that always think confidence can replace money. One of the older executives shifted slightly in his chair at that comment but stayed silent. Raymond adjusted his watch again. "Forget it," he said. "We focus on tonight." The waiter began pouring water into crystal glasses as the meeting prepared to resume. But several minutes later, the restaurant doors opened again. This time, security entered. And their expressions were worse. The head of security approached the table carefully. "Mr. Hale." Raymond's patience was nearly gone. "What now?" The guard lowered his voice. "The guest requested your name specifically." Tyler laughed openly this time. "You've got fans now, Dad." But Raymond didn't laugh. "Who is he?" The guard hesitated. "He wouldn't say." "And you still haven't removed him?" The guard exchanged a quick glance with the manager behind him. "That's becoming difficult." Raymond stood slowly from his chair. The room immediately became still. "Explain." The guard straightened slightly. "He isn't threatening anyone, sir. He's calm. Quiet, but every time we ask him to leave, he says the same thing." "What thing?" The guard paused. "He says Mr. Hale invited him." Silence hit the room. Tyler shook his head immediately. "That's impossible." Raymond's expression hardened. "I didn't invite anyone besides our scheduled guests." The guard nodded carefully. "That's what we assumed." Raymond grabbed the edge of the table lightly. "Then remove him." The guard didn't move. And that hesitation changed something. Raymond noticed it instantly. "Why are you hesitating?" The guard answered carefully, "Because one of the staff recognized him." A small pause entered the room. Tyler looked annoyed now. Recognized who? The guard looked toward Raymond. The guest. Raymond's eyes narrowed. From where? The guard swallowed once. I think he may be someone important. Tyler scoffed immediately. Important people don't walk into luxury hotels dressed like that. The guard didn't respond. Because deep down, even he no longer sounded certain. Raymond stared at him for another second before speaking again. Fine, he said coldly. I'll handle it myself. The executive shifted uncomfortably as Raymond stepped away from the table. Tyler stood too. I'm coming. Together, they walked through the restaurant toward the lobby. The atmosphere changed immediately as nearby guests noticed them moving with purpose. The Grand Meridian lobby glowed beneath massive gold chandeliers and towering marble columns. Luxury cars moved outside the glass entrance while piano music echoed softly through hidden speakers. And near the center seating area sat a man alone. Simple dark jacket, old boots. Gray backpack resting beside his chair. Calm. Still. Like he didn't notice the tension gathering around him. 2 security guards stood nearby. The restaurant manager waited nervously beside them. But the seated man remained completely relaxed. Tyler saw him first and almost laughed. That's the guy. Raymond didn't answer immediately. Because something about the man felt strangely familiar. Not his clothes. Not his posture. Something else. The seated man slowly looked up as they approached. And suddenly the entire lobby felt quieter. Raymond stopped walking for half a second without understanding why. The stranger stood calmly to his feet. Not aggressively. Not nervously. Just respectfully. You're Raymond Hale, the man said calmly. Raymond straightened slightly. Yes. The man nodded once. Thank you for finally coming out here. Tyler stepped forward immediately. You've got a lot of nerve causing problems in a private hotel. The stranger looked at him briefly. I wasn't causing problems. You refused to leave. I refused to disappear. That answer landed differently than expected. Tyler frowned. What's that supposed to mean? The man didn't react emotionally. It means sometimes people decide you don't belong somewhere before they know anything about you. Fine, he said coldly. I'll handle it myself. The executive shifted uncomfortably as Raymond stepped away from the table. Tyler stood too. I'm coming. Together, they walked through the restaurant toward the lobby. The atmosphere changed immediately as nearby guests noticed them moving with purpose. The Grand Meridian lobby glowed beneath massive gold chandeliers and towering marble columns. Luxury cars moved outside the glass entrance while piano music echoed softly through hidden speakers. And near the center seating area sat a man alone. Simple dark jacket, old boots. Gray backpack resting beside his chair. Calm. Still. Like he didn't notice the tension gathering around him. 2 security guards stood nearby. The restaurant manager waited nervously beside them. But the seated man remained completely relaxed. Tyler saw him first and almost laughed. That's the guy. Raymond didn't answer immediately. Because something about the man felt strangely familiar. Not his clothes. Not his posture. Something else. The seated man slowly looked up as they approached. And suddenly the entire lobby felt quieter. Raymond stopped walking for half a second without understanding why. The stranger stood calmly to his feet. Not aggressively. Not nervously. Just respectfully. You're Raymond Hale, the man said calmly. Raymond straightened slightly. Yes. The man nodded once. Thank you for finally coming out here. Tyler stepped forward immediately. You've got a lot of nerve causing problems in a private hotel. The stranger looked at him briefly. I wasn't causing problems. You refused to leave. I refused to disappear. That answer landed differently than expected. Tyler frowned. What's that supposed to mean? The man didn't react emotionally. It means sometimes people decide you don't belong somewhere before they know anything about you. Silence touched the lobby for a second. Raymond studied the stranger more carefully now. The face. The voice. The calmness. Something about him continued pulling at memory. Who are you? Raymond finally asked. The man looked directly at him. My name is Elias Mercer. No reaction. Tyler folded his arms. Never heard of you. Elias nodded calmly. That's okay. But Raymond still stared. Because now the familiarity was getting stronger. Elias reached slowly into his jacket pocket. Security immediately tensed. But Elias only removed a folded envelope. I came because your company received something 10 years ago that never belonged to you. The lobby became completely still. Raymond frowned deeply. What are you talking about? Elias held out the envelope. Your father knew my father. That sentence hit Raymond instantly. Not emotionally, but historically. His father had died 8 years earlier. And almost nobody mentioned him anymore. Tyler looked confused. What is this? But Raymond's eyes stayed locked on Elias. Because now the recognition was forming. Slowly. Painfully. And somewhere deep in memory, he had seen this man before. The Grand Meridian lobby no longer felt like a luxury hotel. It felt like a courtroom where nobody understood the case yet. The chandeliers still glowed overhead. Piano music still drifted softly through hidden speakers. Guests still moved through the marble halls carrying expensive bags and polished confidence. But near the center seating area, everything had narrowed into silence. Raymond Hale stared at the envelope in Elias Mercer's hand without touching it. His expression had changed. Not dramatically, but enough. The certainty that usually controlled every room he entered had weakened slightly, replaced by something harder to identify. Memory. Tyler noticed it immediately. Dad, he asked quietly. Raymond didn't answer. His eyes stayed on Elias. You said our fathers knew each other, Raymond said carefully. Elias nodded once. They worked together before Hale Dynamics existed. Tyler frowned. That's impossible. My grandfather built Hale Dynamics himself. Elias looked at him calmly. That's the version people remember. The sentence landed heavily. Several nearby hotel staff exchanged nervous glances while security remained frozen in place, uncertain whether this was still a disturbance or something far more serious. Raymond finally reached forward and took the envelope. His movements were slower now. Controlled. Cautious. The paper looked old. Not recently made old. Time-worn old. The edges were faded slightly. The seal had yellowed with age. And written across the front in dark ink were 4 words. For Daniel Hale only. Raymond's face tightened instantly. That was his father's name. Tyler stepped closer. What is this? Raymond ignored him for a moment and slowly opened the envelope. Inside was a single photograph. The moment he saw it, something inside him stopped. The photo showed 2 younger men standing beside unfinished construction equipment decades earlier. One of them was unmistakably Daniel Hale. The other man stood beside him smiling, dirt on his hands, blueprints tucked beneath one arm. Elias's father. Raymond stared at the image longer than expected. Because his father looked different in this picture. Not powerful. Not wealthy. Just equal. Tyler leaned closer. Who's that with Grandpa? Elias answered quietly. Thomas Mercer. The name meant nothing to Tyler. But Raymond remembered it instantly. Not clearly. Not fully. But enough to disturb him. A memory surfaced somewhere deep in childhood. Late-night arguments behind office doors. His father drinking alone. A name spoken once with anger. Mercer. Raymond slowly looked up from the photo. "What is this really about?" he asked quietly. Elias remained calm. "My father helped build the first Hale prototype systems." Tyler laughed once in disbelief. "No offense, but if that were true, we would have heard about him." Elias looked toward him briefly. "Not everyone gets remembered equally." That answer hit harder than Tyler expected. Raymond unfolded another paper inside the envelope. This one was older. A contract draft. Handwritten notes covered the margins. At the bottom were 2 signatures. Daniel Hale. Thomas Mercer. Raymond's breathing slowed slightly. Because this was real. Not rumor. Not imagination. Evidence. Tyler's confidence began slipping now. "What exactly are you saying?" he asked. Elias finally spoke more directly. "I'm saying Hale Dynamics was built by 2 men." Silence filled the lobby again. But only one name survived. Raymond stared at the document. His father had never mentioned a partner. Never. The company history always described Daniel Hale as a lone visionary who built everything from nothing. That story had become part of the company identity. Part of the family identity. And now, standing in the center of a luxury hotel lobby, that story was cracking open. Tyler crossed his arms tighter. "If your father was so important, where has he been all these years?" Elias looked at him quietly. "Dead." The word landed without emotion, which somehow made it heavier. Tyler shifted uncomfortably. Elias continued. "He died 11 years ago." Raymond looked up slowly. "What happened?" A faint pause entered Elias's expression. "Cancer." The lobby remained silent. Even the nearby guests pretending not to listen had stopped moving naturally now. Raymond looked back down at the papers. His voice lowered. "Why are you bringing this to me now?" Elias answered immediately. "Because my father asked me to." Raymond frowned. "After all these years?" Elias nodded once. "He told me not to come unless Hale Dynamics became the kind of company that forgot where it started." That sentence settled heavily into the room. Tyler scoffed softly, trying to recover control. "This is ridiculous." But his voice lacked conviction now. Elias didn't react to him. Instead, he looked directly at Raymond. "My father never wanted money." Raymond's eyes narrowed slightly. "Then what did he want?" Elias paused. "Recognition." The word hung quietly between them. Not greed. Not revenge. Recognition. And somehow that made everything harder. Because money could have been dismissed. But dignity? That was different. Raymond looked down again at the photo in his hands. 2 men standing side by side before success existed. Before wealth separated memory from truth. His father looked genuinely happy in the image. That disturbed him more than anything else. Tyler stepped forward again. "So what now?" he asked sharply. "You show up dressed like this in a hotel lobby and expect us to rewrite company history?" Elias finally turned fully toward him. His expression remained calm. "I dressed like this because these are my clothes." Tyler opened his mouth slightly but said nothing. Elias continued quietly. "And the fact that everyone here decided what I was worth within 30 seconds. He glanced briefly around the lobby. "Kind of proves my point." Nobody spoke. Because nobody could honestly deny it. The restaurant manager looked down. One security guard shifted uncomfortably. Even Raymond said nothing. Because deep down, He knew Elias was right. The lobby had judged him before hearing a single word. Raymond slowly folded the documents back into the envelope. "Why didn't you contact legal representatives?" he asked. Elias gave a faint, almost tired smile. "Would they have let me into the building?" No one answered. Because again, he was right. Tyler looked increasingly frustrated now. "This doesn't prove ownership." Elias nodded calmly. "I know." "Then what do you want?" Elias looked directly at Raymond when he answered. "I want the truth acknowledged before everyone who helped create it is forgotten." That sentence changed the emotional temperature completely. This wasn't a scam. It wasn't blackmail. It was something much quieter. And much more uncomfortable. Raymond glanced again at the photograph. Then slowly at Elias himself. And suddenly he noticed something he hadn't before. The resemblance, not physical exactly, but behavioral. The calmness. The patience. The refusal to force attention. It reminded him painfully of his father. Tyler interrupted again. "Dad, this is insane. We have investors waiting upstairs." But Raymond didn't move immediately. His eyes stayed on Elias. "You came alone?" he asked quietly. Elias nodded. "Yes." "No lawyers?" "No." "No media?" "No." Tyler looked confused. "Why not?" Elias answered simply. "Because this wasn't supposed to become a fight." That answer silenced even Tyler for a moment. The lobby doors opened briefly as another wealthy guest entered from outside laughing into a phone call. But the energy inside the room no longer matched the luxury around it. Something real had entered the building. And nobody knew what to do with it. Raymond finally exhaled slowly. Then he made a decision that surprised everyone. "Come upstairs," he said. Tyler turned immediately. "What?" Raymond ignored him. He looked directly at Elias. "If this conversation continues..." He glanced toward the surrounding crowd. "It won't happen in a hotel lobby." Elias studied him quietly for a second. Then nodded once. "Okay." Tyler stepped closer to his father, lowering his voice sharply. "You cannot be serious." Raymond finally looked at him. And for the first time tonight, there was uncertainty in his eyes. "That photo is real," he said quietly. Tyler looked stunned. "But I know my father's handwriting." Silence hit again. Tyler looked between Raymond and Elias as if the entire room had suddenly shifted beneath him. Because it had. Raymond turned toward the elevators. Security stepped aside immediately. The restaurant manager looked completely lost now. Guests whispered softly as the three men began walking across the marble floor together. But nobody spoke during the walk. Not Raymond. Not Tyler. Not Elias. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime. Raymond stepped inside first. Elias followed calmly. Tyler hesitated for half a second before entering last. As the doors slowly closed, Tyler finally looked toward Elias again. And this time, there was less judgment in his expression, but far more uncertainty. The elevator climbed in complete silence. Soft instrumental music played overhead while floor numbers glowed one by one above the doors. Outside the glass walls of the hotel, Manhattan stretched endlessly into the night, alive with light and movement. But inside the elevator, nobody looked at the view. Raymond Hale stood motionless near the control panel, the old envelope still in his hand. Tyler stood beside him, arms crossed tightly, his jaw tense with confusion he could no longer hide, and Elias Mercer remained calm. Not confident. Not nervous. Just steady. As if he had already accepted whatever outcome waited upstairs long before entering the hotel. The elevator doors finally opened onto the executive dining floor. Immediately, conversations inside the private room softened. Executives looked toward the entrance expecting Raymond to return alone. Instead, they saw a man carrying a worn gray backpack walk in beside him. The atmosphere changed instantly. Tyler noticed the reactions immediately. The confusion. The judgment, the same judgment he himself had carried less than an hour earlier. A senior executive leaned toward another and whispered quietly, "Who is that?" Nobody answered. Because Raymond himself still wasn't fully sure. Raymond walked slowly back toward the head of the table. "Everyone stay seated," he said calmly. The authority in his voice silenced the room immediately. Elias remained near the entrance at first, taking in the polished walls, expensive artwork, and perfectly arranged dining table without visible reaction. Tyler moved closer to Raymond and lowered his voice. "You're really doing this?" Raymond answered without looking at him. "I need to hear this." The executives exchanged uneasy glances. One of them, Margaret Levin, the company's legal advisor, adjusted her glasses carefully. "Raymond," she said cautiously, "should we postpone the Donovan negotiations?" Raymond looked at the envelope again. Yes, that single word sent visible shock through the room. The Donovan contract was worth hundreds of millions. People did not postpone meetings like this. Not for strangers from hotel lobbies. But Raymond's attention had shifted completely now. He looked toward Elias. "Sit down." Elias stepped forward slowly and took the empty chair near the far end of the table. Several executives suddenly moved their phones face down on the table. Others simply stared. Tyler finally sat as well, though tension still radiated through him. Raymond placed the old photograph in the center of the table. The executives leaned forward slightly. Margaret picked it up first. Her expression changed immediately. "That's your father," she said quietly. Raymond nodded once. "And the other man," she asked carefully, "is?" Elias answered calmly. "My father. Thomas Mercer." Silence. Margaret studied the photograph more closely. "This is old." 32 years, Elias replied. Raymond leaned back slowly in his chair. "My father never mentioned a partner." Elias nodded slightly. "I know." Tyler frowned. "Then how are we even verifying any of this?" Elias reached calmly into his backpack and removed a worn leather folder. The entire table watched closely now. Inside were blueprints. Old engineering drafts. Prototype calculations. Letters. Dozens of documents carefully preserved over decades. Elias placed them gently on the table one by one. And slowly, the room began to understand. Margaret opened one document, her eyes narrowing. "These are original thermal system concepts." Another executive leaned closer. "That's the early Hale engine architecture." A third executive looked stunned. "These signatures are authentic." Tyler stared at the papers. The confidence he usually carried in business meetings was disappearing fast. Because this wasn't emotional storytelling anymore. It was evidence. Real evidence. Raymond looked at Elias carefully. "Why didn't your father ever come forward publicly?" Elias paused before answering. "Because your father promised him something." Raymond's expression tightened slightly. "What?" "That once the company stabilized, both names would appear together." The silence that followed felt heavier than before. Tyler shook his head slowly. "That never happened." "No," Elias replied quietly. "It didn't." Margaret looked between the documents. "These drafts predate official Hale Dynamics registration by almost a year." One executive muttered softly, "My God." Raymond rubbed his hand slowly across his jaw. For the first time in years, he looked uncertain inside his own boardroom. Elias watched him carefully but without hostility. "My father believed in your father," he said quietly. Raymond looked up. "He trusted him?" Elias nodded once. "At first." The room remained perfectly silent. Outside the massive windows, the city glowed beneath the dark sky. Inside, the foundation of a billion-dollar company was quietly shifting. Tyler suddenly leaned forward. "So what happened?" Elias looked toward him calmly. "Success happened." The answer landed hard. Nobody interrupted. Elias continued. "The company grew faster than they expected. Investors came in. Lawyers came in. Boards formed." He glanced at the documents. "And somewhere along the way, one name became easier to market than two." Raymond lowered his eyes briefly. Because deep down, he already understood how believable that sounded. Margaret opened another folder carefully. Inside were handwritten letters. One caught Raymond's attention immediately. It was addressed directly to Thomas Mercer, and signed by Daniel Hale. Raymond took it slowly. His father's handwriting was unmistakable. He began reading silently. Halfway through, his expression changed. Tyler noticed immediately. "What does it say?" Raymond didn't answer at first. Then quietly, he apologized. The room froze. Raymond kept reading. His father's words filled the silence between them. "I never intended for it to become this. I thought I could fix it later." But later kept moving further away. Raymond stopped reading. His throat tightened slightly. Tyler looked stunned. "You never knew about this?" Raymond shook his head slowly. "No." And for the first time all night, the powerful CEO no longer looked like the man who controlled every outcome. He looked like a son discovering his father had been someone more complicated than memory allowed. Elias remained quiet. He wasn't enjoying this. That became increasingly obvious. This wasn't revenge. It was grief carried carefully for years. Margaret leaned back slowly in her chair. "If these documents are authentic..." She paused. "This changes everything." Tyler looked alarmed immediately. "What does that mean?" Margaret answered carefully. "It means the public history of Hale Dynamics may not be accurate." The sentence settled heavily across the table. One executive whispered quietly, "This could destroy the company," but Elias finally shook his head for the first time. "I didn't come here to destroy anything." Everyone looked at him. He continued calmly. "My father spent his entire life helping build something he never got acknowledged for." A small pause. "He still loved what it became." Raymond stared at him carefully now. "Even after what happened?" Elias nodded once. "Yes." That answer hit Raymond harder than accusation would have. Because bitterness would have been easier to understand. Grace wasn't. Tyler finally looked directly at Elias again, and this time, there was no arrogance left in his face. Only confusion. "Then why now?" he asked quietly. Elias looked down briefly at the old letters before answering. "Because people are forgetting the beginning." The room stayed silent. Elias continued. "My father used to say companies don't lose themselves all at once." He glanced slowly around the luxury boardroom. "They lose themselves one compromise at a time." Nobody moved. Nobody interrupted. Because every person at the table felt the truth inside those words differently. Raymond leaned back slowly, staring at the city lights beyond the windows. His father's apology letter still rested in his hands. For years, Daniel Hale had been more than a parent. He had been an icon. A legend. The foundation of everything Raymond believed about success. And now, that image had cracked open. Tyler spoke softly. So what happens next? Nobody answered immediately. Because suddenly the future of the company felt smaller than the weight of the truth sitting on the table. Finally, Raymond looked toward Elias. What do you want me to do? The room held its breath. Elias met his eyes calmly, and when he answered, his voice carried no anger at all. Tell the truth. Nobody in the boardroom moved after Elias Mercer spoke those 3 words. Tell the truth. The sentence stayed suspended in the air like something larger than a request. Larger than business. Larger than money. Outside the windows, Manhattan continued glowing beneath the night sky, alive and indifferent to the quiet collapse happening inside one executive dining room. Raymond Hale sat motionless at the head of the table. The apology letter from his father remained open in his hands. For years, Daniel Hale had existed in his memory as a symbol of certainty. A self-made visionary. A man who built an empire through brilliance and sacrifice alone. Now that story no longer felt complete. An incomplete truth suddenly felt dangerous. Tyler leaned back slowly in his chair, his earlier confidence completely gone. The room itself had changed shape emotionally. Earlier, it had been a place of negotiation and power. Now it felt personal, uncomfortably personal. Margaret Levin adjusted the documents carefully into a stack again. If this becomes public, she said cautiously, the media response will be enormous. One executive nodded immediately. Investors will panic. Another spoke quietly. Competitors would exploit this instantly. But Elias remained calm. He looked around the room, not defensively, not emotionally, just steadily. My father spent 30 years watching interviews where another man received credit for work they built together. Silence. He never sued anyone, Elias continued. Never contacted reporters. Never tried to damage the company. Raymond lowered his eyes briefly. Elias looked directly at him. He only wanted the truth to survive somewhere. That sentence hit differently than the others. Because it wasn't about ownership anymore. It was about memory. Raymond finally spoke again, but his voice sounded older somehow. You said my father apologized. Elias nodded once. He visited my father 6 months before he died. Tyler looked up sharply. What? Elias turned toward him calmly. He came alone. Raymond's expression tightened. My father never mentioned this. I don't think he could. The room remained completely silent. Elias continued quietly. They talked for almost 4 hours. Raymond stared at him. What did they say? Elias paused. Mostly, they remembered who they used to be. Something shifted visibly in Raymond's face at that answer. Not pain exactly. Something closer to grief. Elias reached into the folder again and removed another photograph. This one was newer. Much newer. It showed 2 older men sitting together on a porch. Daniel Hale. Thomas Mercer. Older now. Tired. Gray-haired. But smiling. Raymond stared at the image for several long seconds. Because this photo destroyed something he had unconsciously believed for years. That there had been enemies. Instead, what he saw looked like regret. Tyler leaned closer slowly. They stayed friends, he asked quietly. Elias gave a faint nod. In a complicated way. The room absorbed that carefully. Margaret folded her hands together. Then why keep it secret? Elias looked toward her. Because by the time my father was ready to speak publicly, the company had become too big. Raymond closed his eyes briefly. Too big. That phrase echoed painfully inside him. Too big for honesty. Too big for correction. Too big to admit where it really began. One executive cleared his throat carefully. With respect, he said, we still need to think about legal consequences here. Elias nodded calmly. I understand. You're not seeking financial compensation? No. Equity? No. Board representation? No. The executive looked genuinely confused now. Then what exactly are you asking for? Elias answered simply. For my father's name to exist where it should have existed all along. The silence afterward felt almost impossible to interrupt. Because nobody at the table could dismiss the request as greed anymore. And that made it harder. Tyler stared at Elias carefully now. For the first time tonight, he saw him differently. Not as an intruder. Not as a threat. But as someone carrying something heavy for a very long time. Raymond slowly stood from his chair and walked toward the windows overlooking the city. Nobody stopped him. The reflection staring back at him from the glass looked unfamiliar somehow. Older. Less certain. He remembered being 12 years old, sitting in his father's office while reporters asked questions about success and innovation. He remembered Daniel Hale smiling proudly beneath camera lights. And now, for the first time, Raymond wondered what his father had felt after those interviews ended. Had guilt followed him home? Had success become heavier every year? Behind him, Tyler finally spoke softly. Dad. But Raymond didn't turn around immediately. He knew, Raymond said quietly. The room stayed still. He knew this wasn't right. Nobody answered. Because the apology letter already confirmed it. Raymond slowly looked back toward the table. He spent his entire life trying to protect the company. His eyes moved toward the photographs. Maybe because he thought telling the truth would destroy it. Margaret spoke carefully. It still could. Raymond nodded once. Yes. No denial. No corporate optimism. Just truth. Elias remained seated quietly. His posture hadn't changed since entering the room. No triumph. No satisfaction. Only patience. Raymond studied him carefully. You really came here alone? Elias nodded. Yes. You trusted us to listen? A faint pause. My father trusted your father once. The room went silent again. Tyler lowered his eyes briefly. Because suddenly the entire night looked different to him. The hotel lobby. The judgment. The assumptions. The way Elias had been treated before anyone knew his name. It all felt embarrassingly familiar now. A company built on forgotten recognition had nearly repeated the same mistake again in a luxury hotel lobby. Tyler exhaled slowly. I treated you badly downstairs. Elias looked toward him calmly. You judged me quickly. Tyler nodded once. Yes. No excuses. That mattered. Elias gave a small nod back. That usually says more about fear than confidence. The sentence landed gently, but directly. Tyler absorbed it quietly. Raymond returned slowly to the table. Then he looked at every executive in the room one by one. For 32 years, he said carefully, this company has told an incomplete story. Nobody interrupted him. My father built Hale Dynamics, he continued. But apparently, he didn't build it alone. Margaret watched him carefully. Raymond, if you move forward publicly with this, there's no controlling what happens next. Raymond nodded slowly. I know. You could lose investors. I know. The board may resist. I know. The room remained silent. Then Raymond looked toward Elias again. But if we bury this now? He glanced at the old photographs. Then we become exactly what my father was afraid of. That sentence changed the room. Because suddenly this wasn't only about the past anymore. It was about who they would become moving forward. Tyler looked at his father carefully. What are you thinking? Raymond stood still for a long moment before answering. Then finally, we tell the truth. Several executives reacted immediately. One leaned forward sharply. Raymond. But Raymond raised a hand calmly. No. The authority in his voice stopped the room instantly. For years we've talked about integrity in this company. His eyes moved across the executives. We print it in reports. We say it in interviews. We frame it on office walls. A pause. Now we find out whether we actually mean it. Silence. Heavy silence. Margaret slowly removed her glasses. When? Raymond looked toward Elias. Then toward the old photograph again. Tomorrow morning. The room froze. Tyler stared at him. You're serious? Yes. The city lights flickered softly outside the windows while the weight of that decision settled over everyone. Tomorrow morning, the story of Hale Dynamics would change forever. Not because of scandal. Not because of exposure. But because one forgotten name had finally walked back into the room where it always belonged. Morning arrived slowly over Manhattan. Sunlight stretched across the glass towers of the city, turning windows gold one by one as the skyline woke beneath a pale blue sky. Traffic filled the streets below. News stations prepared their daily broadcasts. Office buildings reopened their doors. And inside Hale Dynamics headquarters, tension moved quietly through every floor. Employees sensed it immediately. Something unusual was happening. Executives walked faster than normal. Assistants whispered near elevators. Security stood more alert near conference rooms. Phones rang constantly across departments that usually operated with calm precision. Nobody fully understood why. But rumors were already spreading. At 8:15 a.m. Raymond Hale stood alone inside his office overlooking the city. The old photograph rested on his desk beside the apology letter written by his father decades earlier. Daniel Hale. Thomas Mercer. Two men standing side by side before success separated memory from truth. Raymond stared at the image for a long time. Then quietly exhaled. A soft knock came at the door. Come in. Tyler entered. But he looked different than the night before. Less polished somehow. Less certain, which, strangely, made him look more honest. The press conference is ready, Tyler said quietly. Raymond nodded once. Neither man spoke for several seconds. Finally, Tyler looked toward the photograph. I barely slept, he admitted. Raymond gave a faint humorless smile. Neither did I. Tyler hesitated. Do you think Grandpa knew this would happen eventually? Raymond looked out the window briefly before answering. I think he spent years hoping it wouldn't. Silence entered the office again. Then Tyler said something Raymond didn't expect. I judged Elias before I even heard him speak. Raymond looked at his son carefully. Tyler lowered his eyes slightly. And the worst part is, it felt normal when I did it. That honesty stayed between them for a moment. Raymond finally nodded slowly. That's how these things survive. At 8:45 a.m. executives, media representatives, and board members filled the main conference hall inside Hale Dynamics headquarters. Large screens displayed the company logo across illuminated walls. Journalists whispered quietly while cameras adjusted focus toward the stage. Nobody knew exactly what the announcement would be. But everyone sensed its seriousness. Margaret Levin stood near the side entrance reviewing final statements while executives exchanged nervous looks across the front rows. The atmosphere felt less like a business announcement and more like the beginning of something irreversible. Then the side doors opened. And Raymond Hale entered beside Elias Mercer. The room reacted instantly. Cameras shifted. Whispers spread. Some reporters recognized Elias immediately from quiet leaks already moving online overnight. Others simply looked confused by the sight of a plainly dressed man walking beside one of the most powerful CEOs in America. Tyler followed several steps behind them. But unlike yesterday, he no longer walked with distance from Elias. He walked beside him. Raymond stepped to the podium slowly. The room fell silent. For a brief moment, he looked down at the prepared speech resting in front of him. Then he closed the folder completely and pushed it aside. Margaret noticed immediately. So did Tyler. Raymond looked out across the room. When he finally spoke, his voice carried none of the polished confidence people usually expected from corporate leaders. It carried honesty. For most of my life, he began quietly, I believed I understood the story of how Hale Dynamics was built. The room remained completely silent. I believe my father created this company through sacrifice, brilliance, and determination. A pause. And he did. Raymond looked briefly toward Elias. But he did not do it alone. Soft whispers moved instantly through the audience. Gasps spread quietly through the room. Daniel Hale. Thomas Mercer. Standing together. Building something before the world knew either name. This man, Raymond said carefully, Thomas Mercer, helped create the foundation of Hale Dynamics. Every camera in the room turned toward Elias now. But Elias remained calm. Still uncomfortable with attention. Still grounded despite the weight of the moment. Raymond continued. For reasons I cannot fully defend, history remembered only one name. The silence inside the conference hall deepened. My father knew this. That line changed everything. Journalists stopped typing momentarily. Executives lowered their eyes. He carried regret about it for many years, Raymond said quietly. And unfortunately, regret delayed long enough becomes silence. Elias watched him carefully now. Not emotionally. Just attentively. Raymond took a slow breath. This company speaks often about innovation, integrity, and leadership. He looked across the room. But integrity means very little when truth is only convenient during success. The words landed heavily. Tyler stood near the side of the stage, listening differently than anyone else. Because for the first time in his life, he was watching someone choose honesty over protection in real time. Raymond turned slightly toward Elias. Mr. Mercer did not come here seeking money. Reporters exchanged surprised looks immediately. He did not threaten lawsuits. He did not contact media organizations. He did not ask for ownership. Raymond paused. He asked for recognition. Silence. Deep silence. And somehow that silence carried more emotion than applause ever could. Raymond stepped away from the podium then. Not dramatically. Just enough. And looked directly toward Elias. For 32 years, he said quietly, your father's name was missing from the story he helped create. A pause. That ends today. The conference hall remained completely still. Then Raymond extended his hand toward Elias, not performatively. Not politically. Personally. Elias looked at the hand for a brief second. Then shook it. The cameras exploded instantly with flashes. But the moment itself stayed strangely quiet. Because it didn't feel like victory. It felt like correction. Tyler watched Elias carefully, and suddenly remembered the hotel lobby. The assumptions. The judgment. The certainty. All of it built in seconds from appearance alone. Now that same man stood at the center of one of the largest corporate revelations in recent business history. And somehow Elias still looked exactly the same as he had the night before. Calm. Grounded. Unaffected by status. That realization stayed with Tyler deeply. Questions immediately erupted from reporters. Will the company be renamed? Are legal proceedings expected? How much ownership belonged to Thomas Mercer? Did Daniel Hale intentionally hide this? But Raymond raised a hand gently. "Today is not about corporate strategy," he said. "It's about truth." The room slowly quieted again,